can never,
Okay, I'm hearing a little bit,
can never remember
but
to do that. I'm going to mute again because, okay, thank you, Michelle. Thank you so much. Okay, let me back this up, you guys. Now, you have the option, I'm just going to pause this for a second. You have the option of, if you don't feel like you can cover a large area in one pass while keeping the whole thing flowing, you know, and working wet into wet, you know, wet into the wet, keeping the wetness flowing so that you don't get dry, hard edges, then you're welcome to lay a coat of water in the area, especially for beginners. It helps just buy you time. But I find when I do that, it kind of, first of all, you have a little less control. Second of all, it tends to dilute the color. And I like to keep things really vibrant. Can you see the deep color of the water in my screen backdrop behind the painting? You know, notice how dense that color is of the ocean. It's really, it can get really, really deep, dark color. So that's what I'm wanting to get. So I'm going to resume this. I have two blues. I'm using what was I using? I'm using fluid blues, and I've got my test paper there, which you can't really see very well, but I think I'm mixing my, actually, you know what I have? I have my, what do I have? I have three colors there. I think I have a couple of India inks. I have turquoise India ink, and then I have my phthalo blue. That's the Hydrus phthalo blue watercolor. And so I mixed a couple of blues together. And then I also have a aqua, I think it's an aqua India ink. So I'm mixing a couple of colors. Since I have this flat brush, I'm using it along my horizon line to get that straight edge, because with a flat brush, it's a lot easier just to do a pass across the paper and have a nice straight edge. But what I want you to notice is as I go down, so now I'm going to switch to a fairly large round. And as I go down and I'm adding water, I'm dipping into different colors, and I'm going to vary my strokes a little bit, because in the photograph, whoops, see, I got some drips, because as I explained last week, it's not a good idea to have your palette above your painting, but I have it there so that you can see me mixing my colors. But ideally, you want it to the right of you. But the kind of, and you can actually see it a little bit in my screen behind me, how the lines of paint of color changes don't go exactly in a horizontal line. There's a slight curve, there's a slight angling up as it comes into the coastline. So I'm doing that. Now, what I want to show you is how you can put a background behind a foreground and just paint around it. You don't have to use Frisket. So I'm just, you know, I want to keep working this paint while it's wet. I don't want any hard edges in my water, and I don't want any hard edges around the flower. So I just keep working it, keeping it. I had to add water to that to get it more wet. I'm just going into my smaller brush to paint around the flower. Just then I had a little too much pigment in my brush, so instead of wasting it, I added it to my ocean. So you're going to as you paint your ocean across to meet your flowers, you know, paint around those flowers as you go down. And again, I'm using my kind of medium brush. And the idea here is to dip into pretty heavily saturated paint, which hopefully you learned how to create in your abstract, and then adding more watered down colors to get you know, to get variety in the blues. Now up here, I happen to have in my palette some iridescent watercolors in more of a turquoisey tone. It's that Daniel Smith line of iridescence. And I'm adding some of that in to get a little bit of shimmery and also to get a little bit of turquoisey. As I come down to the bottom, which is the foreground, you know, the most forward part of the ocean, my color is going to change a little bit and it's going to get lighter and a little more turquoisey, because that's how the ocean is. As it recedes into the distance, it gets super dark, and then closer up, it's a little more transparent and lighter. So again, I had added some of that iridescent in because you don't want it to be an abrupt change from the intense dark to the lighter turquoise. So you gradually start to introduce that turquoise, you know, toward the back part, and then you'll increase it as you work down the page. But again, you know, dipping into my different blues and then dipping into my water as I go. That little white shape jutting out from the flower is the coastline behind it, which you can't see because you can't see my drawing. But notice how here I'm coming up against the flower. If you just do, you know, one stroke along the flower like that, you can get a nice, clean, crisp edge and have really nice, defined, crystallized shapes. So now I'm dipping more into my aqua and my turquoise as I come down the page. If you were working with a meadow or a field, you could do this same type of thing, except for instead of having these kind of horizontal changes, you would be adding in more like, you know, like flowery or grass-like textures. So your strokes would probably be a little more vertical or rounded in the case of flowers, depending on the photo that you're working from. Okay, so you can see how it's, you know, there's a spatial dimension being created because of the lighter aqua turquoisey color in the foreground going back to the dark. So that's what I wanted to show you. And also, I want you to really tune into how much pigment I'm using. You know, I'm not, just because it's water, which is a transparent element, I'm getting very intense with it because, you know, the ocean is deep and dark, and that's how it is. And plus, I've got some pretty punchy colors there in my flowers, and I need a solid, good contrast to kind of support it and for them to work together. You know, those flowers, the datura, they're pretty delicate, but I've painted them fairly boldly. So I'm going to need some really strong, you know, bold ocean color in the background. Again, I want you to notice how I'm painting around the flower shape. And sometimes people get overwhelmed with that idea and think like it's going to be way too hard, but it's really not. It's, you just kind of methodically go through it. Okay, so that's the ocean part. I'm just showing you a little bit more. Okay, so that's that one. Then next I've got another one here to show you. Turn the music down and scoot it over. Okay, so now I'm going to do the sky. And again, I'm using my flat brush and I'm pretty much just using, remember that the ocean is a darker reflection of the sky. So I'm dipping into mostly my phthalo blue. I'm starting out with my flat brush. Again, you know, a lot of watercolor painters wet the sky before they start, but I want a pretty rich sky. I want one of those really deep blue skies. So I'm just gonna do dry brush and work rapidly and use a lot of water. I just dripped again. So I'm painting around, again, I switched to a smaller brush to paint around the flower. And you know, don't worry too much about drips. It's just part of the process, even though we're working a little more. I happen to be working a little more realistic in this painting. Drips are just part of being a watercolor painter, but you can see how I drag the brush along the edge of that flower to get a nice smooth edge, right? And I'm gonna have to quickly get over there to the left because I can see that's starting to dry, and I certainly don't want any hard edges in my sky, even worse than getting them in the water. So quickly dip my brush, get that flowing again. You know, you go back and forth between doing the sky and then painting around the flowers. And it's super nice when you can use your big brush and just go right up against the flower like I'm doing now. I got a little excess paint up here, so I'm trying to scoop it up and then move it down. And again, the sky gets lighter when it reaches the horizon. And again, you can see the shot in the background of my computer, how it's darker sky blue at the top and it gets lighter along the horizon. So you do that by adding water, right? Because that's how we get lighter colors in our watercolor, is by using the white of the paper and the transparency of the medium and diluting it with water. So just add water as I get down there. Go back to my smaller brush. And again, when I paint around the flower, see, I've got too much paint in there. I'm having to move it across the page and get a little more water on my brush because it needs to be the same tone. Otherwise, you'll have this dark halo going around your flower. So it's important that when you use your small brush to paint around the flower, that it's the same density as the rest of the painting. And I'm going back up and then just refining that edge a little bit. When you're working, trying to get a blend like this in one area, don't try to take on multiple areas of the paper. Like you'll notice that I didn't attempt to do the other side of that flower. I'm just going to wait. I'm just going to do this one section at a time. Now I'm going to go into it. I took some of that excess paint off. I'm painting around. I just kind of got that started, but I'm going to come down around the bottom. That little white edge I've left above the ocean, again, that's that's land, that's coastline in the distance. There's a hill kind of coming up from the, just like in my photo. I hadn't realized this photo on the back on my computer is kind of showing us what I'm painting similarly. Again, I'm pulling some extra paint off of that area and pulling it over to this. Here I'm kind of starting with the edge of the flower and now going to my larger brush and bringing it over to the leaves. As I get to the top, I want to get a little more paint. I got a bit too much there. So let's see how I deal with it. I get water on my brush and I smear it around. And, you know, I'm going to end up with some kind of variation in my sky, but that's okay. Like, I'm not needing it to be a totally perfect blend. Even if you look at the sky on my computer, you can see like there's some, you know, there's some variation in the blend with these kind of really fine clouds, and, you know, the sky is not always a totally, even on a clear day, it's not a totally smooth blend. So I'm not worried about having some variation. And then when I get up to my leaves, I'll have to use my small brush again to really go around those smaller shapes. But I'm just getting this bottom section of the sky here along that coastline. I'm going to speed this up a little because you've got the idea. Painting around that leaf. I had to move my tripod over a little bit so I could get that upper part. But, you know, here's where you, no, just now I had too much paint on my brush for that little tiny area. Again, rather than waste it, I'm going to bring some of it up to that left corner and then get some of that off my brush so I can come back and control that more. You don't want to have too much paint on your brush for a little area. And the sable brush I'm using, it holds a lot of paint. So filling that out and then filling in these smaller shapes. And that's it for the sky. Okay, so now on to the surf, I think is what I'm doing next. Now I happen to have some of this interference blue. It's an acrylic paint. What interference does, it's kind of this milky, pearly acrylic paint, and any color that it touches, it brings it out and it turns it kind of iridescent. I didn't have any pearlescence white, which is what I would normally use for my foam or my surf. And this is the first time I've tried using it, but I, you know, again, you just use what you have on hand and you try to make it work. So I'm adding quite a bit of this interference with a little tiny bit of that blue I thought was dry on my palette, but perhaps since it's an acrylic, I don't know, maybe this is dissolving it a little more or something, but it's getting slightly kind of a bluish tint, which is what I want. I want it to be mostly white, but with a little bit of tint. So I've laid in the beach. I didn't video the beach, but the beach part was a blend of kind of a mauvey brown to more of a burnt sienna, goldeny brown. And I let that dry. And now I'm putting in my foam. So I'm doing kind of a lighter version of it where it hits the beach. And then I think I'll get a little more pigment where it meets the ocean. And even though I'm working with acrylic, what I'm doing here is I'm using a lot of water still in order for it to kind of keep the blending happening and the flow going. And I put in actually a little bit of purple up there. And it's kind of blotchy, so I'm going to get more paint and more water and kind of try to blend that in better. But, you know, when you're painting water and when you're painting waves, it can get a little overwhelming because it's so you know, it's such a, well, it's moving and it's in motion and it's like this element. But if you can just simplify it into a very basic shape and color, then it will really serve you well, and it will still read. It's going to read as surf. You'll see how that happens. But basically just simplify it. But within this shape, I am having some kind of subtle color changes happening. Okay, so I did that. And there was a little bit behind the flower. And again, I wanted, so I don't want it to be, I wanted to read as part of the water. So I'm dropping in some darks here to try to get it to relate a little bit more to the water. And when I looked at the photo of it, I actually saw some purple. So that's what I'm dropping in. And there's kind of that purple in the sand too. So it kind of helps tie together the water and the sand. Okay, so there's the photo I'm working from. I want you to see that. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to mix up some of my colors for the land. And I think I'm starting with the one in the bottom, in the very foreground. So if you look at the photograph and the masses of land, again, you can kind of see that and see this in my computer shot. The colors are a little brighter in the foreground and they get more dark and muted as they go back. So I'm going to start with some fairly bright greens, but look, I'm even with this foreground, I'm mixing in quite a bit of orange and red. That's going to tone them down a little. I don't want super bright green. My brightest greens are going to be in the leaves of my flowers because I want those to really pop forward. So any other greens in the landscape or your seascape, you want to be quite a bit muted. So I'm adding a lot of red and a lot of orange so that, you know, it's almost brown. And I'm getting several different colors to work with, and then I will weave them together. And I'm using a fairly small brush because well, I guess I'm going to go to a little bit of a bigger brush, but it's still in relation to the area I'm painting. It's pretty small. You can see the strokes because there's a lot of color changes that happen in that bluff. And so I don't want large, like with this beach, there's not a lot of color changes. If you look at the beach in this photo, it's pretty flat, right? But in the vegetation, there's all this texture of lights and darks from the grasses. So I'm dipping my brush, and what I want you to notice is how I work across the whole thing with a color in different sections. And then I dip it. I'm going to go to a smaller brush. I'm going to dip it into another color, and I'm going to come back. These areas have slightly dried a little bit so that they can hold a bit of their shape, but they're still wet enough to take a blend. And I'm going to paint next to them. And I have several different colors here that I'm dipping into as I go across. And I'm working from left to right, but I gradually start. I don't do one section at a time like I did in the sky and the ocean. I'm kind of going to try to work the whole thing. But again, you have to, it has to still be a little, let's say, damp, not as wet, but it has to be damp because I don't really want hard edges in this area still. I want it to be kind of soft. But look how much red I'm putting in here. This is significant. And if you look at the photo, there's a lot of red in that, right? The earth is kind of showing through. This is what is going to make your greens really natural and beautiful. It's what makes a fine nature painting is having really well mixed greens. It's the most crucial. It's the most crucial color. You don't want to use bright, harsh tube greens in your landscape paintings because they just simply don't really exist unless you're fertilizing with chemicals. I've got that yellowish green. Again, I'm using, but this is kind of my signature way of painting with watercolor. I use pretty saturated, dense color. I'm using a lot of color. There's a lot of paint in these puddles. My puddles are actually part of the squeezed out tube of color. So I've got strong pigment in there, but it's how I like to paint. I want my hibiscus, which are already pretty saturated, I want those to pop out against a dense backdrop. So I have to make these pretty dense. So I'm going to continue to go along in this fashion. And this is almost done. Okay. So I continued that. Is that the think that's the last video I have. Yeah, that's the last video I have. So what I did, this is the finished painting. So you can see, here's that section, and you can see how I have the, and there are some kind of bright greens here, but they're still mixed, even though they're bright. I have yellow and blue in them, but you can see the kind of, it's almost a little bit marbleized, this earth behind. And then as I go back, I get darker and more muted until this final hillside back here is almost gray, but I did mix it up. It has some purple. I think I might have thrown in a little bit of, I had some extra of this interference color. I think I might have mixed it in to show like a misty effect, how that happens sometimes in the distance. And notice back here the colors, that my two basic colors that I worked here were a muted purple and a muted green, so that it goes back in space. But so, it turned out to be a pretty bold painting. I did this for a frame that I had, that I took something out of that I didn't like, and I put this in the frame, and I have it hanging upstairs in my house, and I'm enjoying it. So it feels like where I wanted to dive in the last few days, but I couldn't because there were too many people at my beach. So anyway, that's the rest of that lesson for this painting. Do you guys have any questions before we move into critique? No? Quiet group today. Any comments? Okay. So
Beautiful paint.
What, Kelly?
Really beautiful painting.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate it. Thank you. I enjoyed doing it.
And it looks so easy when you do it. And
Well,
then when you try it, it doesn't work so well.
so maybe let's talk about that for a minute, because I want you to feel that it's easy. Did you notice what I was doing that made it seem easy?
Painting the ocean, I think you made look easy.
Okay, so how I did that, you guys, was first of all, I spent some time mixing up my puddles of color. You know, you'll really do yourselves a great advantage if you can take the time to put a generous amount of color into your palette. Be generous with the different, you know, how many colors you put in. So give yourself a few choices, and then be generous with how much water you put in. So if you start off with nice, full, rich puddles of color in your palettes, it's going to give you a head start, and you're just going to be able to make the colors flow. And then also by adding water, you know, adding water, you just really need to get into that flow. And the only way you can get flow is with a lot of fluid in water and color. So that's it. And then also being really methodical, starting from the top and then gradually working my way down, and then around the flowers. You know, don't try to go all over the place. Just work your blend down and keep changing, keep adding color and adding water as you go. So that's what makes it look easy.
Thank you.
Okay, anything else? You'll have to unmute, Valerie. You're still muted.
Do you want to stop the recording?
There. How's that?
Good. Yeah, I'll stop the recording.